A footman crossing the carpeted corridor on the principal floor of Buckingham Palace, summer of 1980, tray balanced at the shoulder, paused for no longer than it took to draw a breath outside the Queen's private sitting room. The door stood open by a hand's width. Inside, Elizabeth II was speaking, low and even, to someone whose voice did not carry. The footman heard one sentence, and only one, before he moved on. It concerned, he later told colleagues, the Spencer girl. It was not unkind, it was not warm. It was the kind of remark, he said, that a person makes when they have already begun to worry and have not yet decided what to do about it. That sentence has never been quoted in full in any printed source. The footman who overheard it did not write a memoir. But the moment, or moments very like it, would be recalled over the following 2 decades by a handful of household staff whose accounts converge with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss. Footmen, valets, ladies-in-waiting, private secretaries, people whose professional lives were built on the discipline of not speaking, and who, after the marriage had ended and the princess was dead, found themselves speaking anyway. What they described was not a prophecy. It was something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. They described a queen who had registered, well before the engagement of her eldest son was announced on the 24th of February 1981, that the match being assembled around her was not what the country was being told it was. This is not the familiar story of a cold mother-in-law and a doomed young bride. The record, examined carefully, does not support that version. Elizabeth II appears, by every credible account, to have been fond of Lady Diana Spencer, and to have remained fond of her through years in which fondness was not the easiest position to hold. The story is something else. It is about what the Queen saw, and what she did not say, and what the people who carried her trays and pressed her son's shirts later believed she had been trying, in her own constrained way, to signal. To understand why the Queen was watching at all, it is necessary to understand who Lady Diana Spencer was in the summer of 1980. She was 19 years old. She had been born on the 1st of July 1961 at Park House, on the Sandringham estate, in a wing of a property leased from the Crown. Her father, Earl Spencer, had served as equerry to George VI and to Elizabeth II in the early years of her reign. Her grandmother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, was woman of the bedchamber to the Queen Mother, and, more than that, her closest and most trusted friend. The Spencers were not strangers brought in from outside the world of the court. They were, in many respects, already inside it. Diana had played with Prince Andrew and Prince Edward as a child at Sandringham. She knew the corridors. She knew the protocol, at least in outline. She also knew, by the summer of 1980, that she was being looked at. Prince Charles was 31. He was unmarried, and the pressure for him to settle the question of the succession had become, in the year preceding, almost intolerable. In August 1979, his great-uncle and confidant, Lord Mountbatten, had been killed by a bomb placed aboard his fishing boat off the coast of Sligo. Mountbatten had been, in Charles's own phrase, his honorary grandfather, and had also been the most persistent voice in his ear on the subject of marriage. Mountbatten's advice had been blunt and, to modern ears, faintly chilling. Charles should choose, he had said, a sweet-charactered girl before she has met anyone else. The candidate, by Mountbatten's logic, ought to be young, unformed, untroubled by prior attachments, and amenable to the institution she would be joining. After Mountbatten's death, that advice acquired the weight of a final instruction. The Queen, in this period, was operating in the manner that those who worked closely with her had long since learned to read. Sally Bedell Smith, in her 2012 biography, described Elizabeth II as a woman who rarely intervened directly in her children's personal lives, preferring observation to instruction. Lady Susan Hussey, who had served as a lady-in-waiting since 1960 and who knew the Queen's habits as well as anyone outside her immediate family, made the same point in interviews given many years later. Staff at Buckingham Palace learned to gauge the temperature of the household by what the Queen did not say as much as by what she did. A withheld remark, a slight pause before a routine question, the placement of a teacup with what one footman described as particular care. These were the signals. They were not dramatic. They were, however, legible to anyone who had spent long enough in her service to know how to read them. It is from this circle of legible silences that the story of the so-called warning is reconstructed. The principal witnesses are not, in most cases, glamorous figures, and their reliability varies. Paul Burrell, who entered royal service as a footman to the Queen in 1976 and later became Diana's butler, published A Royal Duty in 2003 and has been, ever since, a contested source. His accounts, taken on their own, require corroboration. Stephen Barry, who served as Prince Charles's valet from 1970 until 1982, published Royal Service in 1983, before the marriage had collapsed and before there was any commercial advantage in painting it darkly. His testimony is generally regarded as more reliable. Patrick Jeffson, who became Diana's private secretary in 1988 and whose Shadows of a Princess appeared in 2000, was a participant in the later years rather than the earlier ones, but his observations of the household culture confirm the broader pattern. Around these three, the larger picture is filled in by Andrew Morton's reporting, Tina Brown's research for the Diana Chronicles, and the long, patient work of historians like Robert Lacey. What these sources read against one another suggest is that by the late summer of 1980, the Queen had begun asking a particular kind of question about her son's courtship. Not the broad questions a mother might be expected to ask, specific ones. Questions about Lady Diana's age, questions about her education, which had been brief, questions about whether the girl, who was working as a kindergarten assistant at the Young England School in Pimlico, had any conception of the life that was being prepared for her. These questions, by themselves, prove nothing. Mothers ask such questions. Queens, perhaps, ask them more carefully. But they were noticed, and they were remembered, and they were the prelude to the weekend that everyone in the household understood would settle the matter one way or the other. In the first days of September 1980, the royal household assembled at Balmoral. Lady Diana Spencer arrived by car from the south, 19 years old, a kindergarten assistant carrying a small suitcase, walking into the weekend that would decide everything. And the Queen, by the fireplace, said nothing. The royal household assembled at Balmoral in early September 1980, watching a 19-year-old kindergarten assistant arrive for the weekend that would decide everything. The Queen, by the fireplace, said nothing. The mornings at Balmoral that September were already cold. Mist hung over the Dee, the heather was turning, and the stalking parties left the castle before breakfast, in Land Rovers loaded with rifles and sandwiches. Lady Diana Spencer was placed in a guest room on the south side, given a maid, and told the schedule. She had been to Balmoral before as a child, visiting cousins on the Sandringham circuit, but she had never been there as a candidate. The distinction was understood by everyone in the house, including the footman who carried her cases up. The weekend was structured, as Balmoral weekends always were, around the testing of a guest's stamina, manners, and willingness to be uncomfortable without complaint. Diana, by every later account, passed. She walked the hills in borrowed boots. She did not flinch at the weather. She sat through the long dinners in the green dining room and laughed at the right moments. She charmed the Queen Mother, who had known her since infancy, and she was careful, almost watchful, with the Queen herself. The press, alerted to her presence, had massed at the estate gates with telephoto lenses. One photograph taken that week, of Diana in a tweed skirt beside the River Dee, would be reprinted in every newspaper in Britain by the following Tuesday. Stephen Barry, Prince Charles's valet since 1970, was at Balmoral that weekend in his usual capacity. In his memoir, Royal Service, published in 1983, and the earliest substantial insider account of the courtship, Barry recorded an impression he said he had formed at the time, and not in retrospect. The Queen, he wrote, was studying Lady Diana more closely than she had studied any of the previous candidates who had passed through the family's orbit during the long search for a Princess of Wales. Her manner toward the girl was warm. Her questions, when she asked them, were specific. And there was, Barry suggested, a quality of reservation in the Queen's attention that he had not seen before. This is the moment at which the household first registered what staff would later call the warning. Paul Burrell, then a footman of 4 years' standing in the Queen's private apartments at Buckingham Palace, was not at Balmoral that particular weekend. But on the family's return to London, he later recalled, in his 2003 memoir, A Royal Duty, a remark overheard in the corridor outside the Queen's sitting room. The Queen, speaking to a member of her household, whose identity Burrell did not name, observed that Lady Diana seemed extremely young, and asked whether the girl understood what was actually being offered to her. The remark was not hostile. It was, in Burrell's telling, almost protective. But it was the question of a woman who had already begun to calculate the distance between a 19-year-old's imagination and the institution waiting to receive her. Burrell is a contested source, and his account must be handled with care. He has been accused, by other former members of the household, of embellishment and self-promotion. But on this specific point, the corroboration is unusually firm. Lady Susan Hussey, the Queen's longest-serving lady-in-waiting, made similar observations in interviews conducted by Sally Bedell Smith for her 2012 biography, Elizabeth the Queen. Bedell Smith's account, drawing on Hussey and on other unnamed members of the Queen's circle, describes Elizabeth II in the autumn of 1980 as quietly preoccupied with the question of whether Lady Diana Spencer was prepared for what would be asked of her. The Queen did not raise the matter publicly. She raised it, in her usual way, by asking small questions of the people around her and listening to the answers. There was a second source of doubt, and it came from inside the Spencer family itself. Ruth, Lady Fermoy, Diana's maternal grandmother, was the Queen Mother's closest friend and her woman of the bedchamber. She had known Diana since the day she was born at Park House. She also, by every credible account, had private reservations about her granddaughter as a future Princess of Wales. Tina Brown's The Diana Chronicles, published in 2007 and drawing on extensive interviews with figures inside both the Spencer and Windsor circles, records that Lady Fermoy told the Queen Mother she did not believe the temperaments of Diana and Charles would match. Lady Fermoy herself, before her death in 1993, confirmed the substance of these reservations to 2 separate interviewers. Whatever Lady Fermoy said to the Queen Mother would, in the closed economy of that household, have reached the Queen. The grandmother of the candidate was, in effect, warning against the candidacy. It is a detail rarely emphasized in the public account, and it altered the temperature of the family's deliberations in ways the press did not see. The third element of the warning was the one no one in the household needed to be told, because everyone already knew it. Camilla Parker Bowles, with whom Prince Charles had been in a relationship of varying intensity since 1971, had not been cleanly removed from his life. Stephen Barry's memoir is the most explicit on this point among the insider accounts. As Charles's valet, Barry packed his employer's bags, took his telephone messages, and observed his movements. He understood, as the other senior members of the prince's staff understood, that the Parker Bowles connection had been suspended rather than ended. Sir Robert Fellows, the Queen's private secretary, and, by an accident of family history, Diana's brother-in-law, was in a position to know the same thing. So, in all probability, was the Queen. This is the point at which the staff testimony becomes most useful. The warning, as the household later understood it, was not principally a warning about Diana. It was a warning about what Diana was being delivered into. A 19-year-old without serious experience of adult life, without a finished education, without any tested capacity to navigate a court, was being matched to a 31-year-old man whose emotional attachments lay elsewhere and who had not yet found the means to resolve them. The Queen, on the available evidence, saw this clearly. The question was what, if anything, she could do about it. By November of 1980, the pressure had moved beyond the family's control. Photographers were stationed permanently outside Diana's flat at Coleherne Court. Her colleagues at the Young England Kindergarten were being doorstepped. The newspapers had begun to print the engagement as a foregone conclusion, and the Prince of Wales, by every account, was being pushed toward a decision he was not ready to make. He is reported to have told a friend that winter that he was terrified of making such a promise. The remark, repeated in several biographical accounts, is consistent with the picture his valet was watching from a closer range. The sympathetic context for the Queen's silence is important. She was, in late 1980, a 54-year-old monarch with 28 years on the throne. She had a Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, in the early stages of a difficult premiership. She had a Commonwealth to manage. She had a Prince of Wales who was publicly seen to want the match, a Queen Mother who actively favoured it, a press already projecting a fairy tale onto the candidate, and a country willing to believe the projection. Robert Lacey's research on the Queen's working method suggests she reach for the only tool available to a constitutional sovereign who is also a mother: time and quiet questions. She did not block, she watched. On the morning of 24th of February 1981, the engagement was announced. The couple appeared on the lawn of Buckingham Palace, then sat for a joint interview with ITN. The interviewer asked whether they were in love. Lady Diana said yes, of course. Prince Charles, after a pause, said, "Whatever in love means." The phrase travelled around the world within hours and has been quoted in every account of the marriage published since. According to two footmen, later interviewed for the biographical record, the Queen watched the broadcast in her private sitting room. One of them recalled that she set down her teacup with what he described as particular care. The detail is small. It belongs to the genre of observation that cannot be verified and cannot be dismissed. What can be said is that the household by that afternoon understood that whatever the Queen had been weighing through the autumn had now been settled by events rather than by her. The wedding was set for the 29th of July 1981 at St. Paul's Cathedral. The institution closed ranks around the marriage in the way institutions do. The Queen, having registered her reservations in the only forms available to her, now had a daughter-in-law to support and a public spectacle to underwrite. The dress was commissioned, the guest list was drawn, the route was rehearsed. The carriage left St. Paul's that July morning before an estimated television audience of 750 million, and the Queen rode in the procession behind it. Back at Buckingham Palace, the household staff were already preparing the rooms for a Princess of Wales who, according to one footman quoted in the later memoir literature, had no idea what was waiting for her inside that building. The carriage had long since passed. The crowds along the Mall had thinned by dusk, and by the time the wedding parties dispersed from Buckingham Palace that evening of 29th of July 1981, the household staff were already moving through the upper floors, finishing the rooms that would, in a matter of weeks, belong to the new Princess of Wales. Those rooms were on the north side of the building, off the corridor that connected to Prince Charles's existing apartments. A bedroom, a sitting room, a small study, a dressing room, a bathroom retiled the previous spring. The furniture was largely chosen for her. The colour scheme had been approved without her seeing it. When Diana returned from her honeymoon aboard the Britannia in mid-August, jet-lagged and already losing weight, the suite was waiting. So was the silence. Paul Burrell, then still a footman on the Queen's floor, later wrote that the contrast between the public princess and the private one became apparent almost at once. In public she dazzled. In private she ate alone, often from a tray, often only picking. By the autumn of 1981, the household was already aware of what Andrew Morton, in his 1992 book, would identify as bulimia. Patrick Jeffson, who would join Diana's staff only in 1988, found the same pattern entrenched on his arrival. The princess was 20 years old, pregnant with the heir to the throne by November, and quietly disintegrating inside a building she did not yet know how to navigate. The Queen's response, as reconstructed by Sally Bedell Smith and corroborated by Lady Susan Hussey, was neither cold nor distant. It was, characteristically, careful. She invited Diana for tea in her own sitting room. She consulted the royal physicians. She asked Lady Hussey, one of her longest-serving ladies-in-waiting, to take the new princess under her wing, to explain the rhythms of the palace, the protocols, the small, invisible rules that governed everything from the order of carriages to the form of address used by senior staff. This is the underreported half of the relationship. The Queen tried. She tried within the limits of who she was. She was not a woman given to spontaneous embraces or weeping confidences, and she was not about to become one for the sake of her daughter-in-law. But she did what she knew how to do. She delegated, she observed, and she made herself available. It was not enough. It could not have been enough. The young woman in those rooms needed something the institution was structurally unable to provide, and the Queen, who had spent her own apprenticeship learning to substitute duty for feeling, may have been the last person in the building equipped to recognize what was missing. Prince William was born at St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington, on the 21st of June, 1982. For a brief period, the marriage seemed to settle. There were photographs from Kensington Palace. There was a nursery. There was the public pageant of a young family. Behind the scenes, the picture was less reassuring. Charles had bought Highgrove House in Gloucestershire in 1980, before the engagement was announced. The choice of location had been noted at the time, quietly, by a small number of people who understood what it meant. Highgrove sat roughly 15 miles from Bolehide Manor, where Camilla Parker Bowles was then living with her husband. By 1983, by some accounts as early as the summer of 1982, household staff at Highgrove had begun to observe what Wendy Berry would later describe in her contested memoir, and what Stephen Barry, before his death in 1986, had already hinted at in interviews supporting his own book, that the Prince and Princess of Wales were functionally living separate lives whenever they were in the country. Sir Robert Fellows, the Queen's private secretary, was Diana's brother-in-law. He was also a man of considerable discretion, and the channel through which information about the Wales marriage reached the Queen's desk. Sally Bedell Smith's Reconstruction is that by the mid-1980s, the Queen was being briefed in measured and unsensational language on a situation she had privately anticipated 4 years earlier. She did not say so. She rarely said so to anyone. But Lady Hussey, in remarks later relayed by Tina Brown, suggested that the Queen's silences in this period had a particular weight to them, the weight of a person watching a forecast prove accurate without taking any satisfaction in the fact. Prince Harry was born on the 15th of September 1984. The accounts vary on exactly when Charles and Diana's marriage entered its final deterioration, but Diana herself, speaking to Andrew Morton through intermediaries in 1991, dated the irrecoverable breach to that autumn. Charles, she said, had hoped for a daughter. He had also, by then, resumed contact with Camilla, if indeed it had ever truly stopped. The public tours during this period only deepened the difficulty inside the marriage. Australia, in the spring of 1983, with the infant William carried along at Diana's insistence, was a triumph for the princess and a quiet humiliation for the prince. The United States in November 1985, the White House dinner, the dance with John Travolta, produced photographs that would define Diana for the rest of her life, and that produced, according to Footmen at Buckingham Palace, quoted later by Balmoral, a Prince of Wales who returned to London in a temper that lingered for weeks. The Queen, Lady Hussey told Sally Bedell Smith in interviews for the 2012 biography, had seen this coming as well. She had understood, before her son had, that marrying a woman the cameras adored would not flatter a man who had spent his entire life being the second most interesting person in any photograph that included his mother. It is here that the phrase the household staff would later use settles into its full meaning. The warning, as Paul Burrell and others framed it in their memoirs, was not a single sentence or a single afternoon. It was a posture, a set of small observations made by the Queen over a period of months in 1980 that by the middle of the decade had hardened into a shared understanding among the senior staff. The footmen who had been at Balmoral in September 1980, the valets who had dressed the Prince of Wales through his engagement, the ladies-in-waiting who had watched the princess arrive in her suite of rooms in August 1981. These were people still in post in 1985, in 1986, in 1987. They had watched the forecast become weather. One footman, in the passage from Burrell's A Royal Duty that has been most often quoted, recalled the Queen saying, in the privacy of her own sitting room and to no one in particular, that she had hoped to be wrong. The fairness of the record requires a counterweight, and the counterweight is Diana herself. In the Panorama interview broadcast on the 20th of November 1995, a conversation conducted in conditions the Queen would later regard as a serious breach of trust, the Princess of Wales did not blame her mother-in-law. She blamed Charles. She blamed Camilla. She blamed what she called the system. When she spoke of the Queen at all, she spoke of a woman who had tried to help and who had, in her own way, listened. Patrick Jeffson's Shadows of a Princess, published in 2000 by a man who had served as Diana's private secretary for 8 years, confirms this. The relationship between the Queen and the princess was formal. It was occasionally awkward. It was not hostile. The two women had, in the end, a workable understanding of one another, founded on the shared knowledge that they were both inside a situation neither had built. The years from 1986 to 1992 are the years in which the private collapse became a public one. Camilla's renewed presence in Charles's life moved from rumour to documented fact. Diana's relationships outside the marriage, James Hewitt most prominently, followed. In August 1992, The Sun published a transcript of a telephone conversation between Diana and James Gilby that became known as the Squidgygate tape. In January 1993, after the separation, came the recording known as Camillagate. Before either of these, in June 1992, Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story had appeared, secretly cooperated on by the princess through the intermediary of her friend James Colthurst. The book detailed the bulimia, the suicide attempts, the Camilla situation, the years of isolation inside Buckingham Palace. It was a document the Queen read with what staff described as visible distress. On the 24th of November 1992, at a Guildhall luncheon marking the 40th anniversary of her accession, the Queen used the phrase that would define the year, annus horribilis. 2 weeks later, on the 9th of December 1992, the Prime Minister, John Major, rose in the House of Commons and read the formal announcement that the Prince and Princess of Wales were to separate. Inside Buckingham Palace that afternoon, a footman closed the door to a sitting room in which the Queen sat alone with the day's papers. It was the same room, the same chair, where 12 years earlier she had first asked about the Spencer girl. The 9th of December, 1992. The formal separation announcement was read in the House of Commons by the Prime Minister, John Major, in the flat tones reserved for constitutional business. Inside Buckingham Palace, a footman later recalled closing the door to a sitting room in which the Queen sat alone with the day's papers. It was the same room, the same chair, where 12 years earlier she had first asked, quietly, about the Spencer girl. What happened next, according to Sally Bedell-Smith's Reconstruction and the parallel reporting in Tina Brown's account, was uncharacteristically swift. Within days of the separation, the Queen wrote privately to both her son and her daughter-in-law. The letters were not preserved publicly, but their substance was understood inside the household. She was instructing them to divorce. The hesitation of 1980 had been replaced by something harder. She had spent 12 years watching the marriage fail in slow motion. She would not watch it fail for another 12. The Panorama broadcast of the 20th of November 1995 made delay impossible. Diana, sitting in Kensington Palace under low light, told Martin Bashir there had been 3 people in her marriage. She questioned whether Charles would ever be king. She spoke of the institution as something that had failed to protect her. The Queen watched, by all accounts, in silence. 3 weeks later, a second letter went to both parties. This one was not a suggestion. The divorce was finalised on the 28th of August, 1996. Diana retained the title Princess of Wales, but lost the style of Her Royal Highness. The negotiations, conducted through Sir Robert Fellows and the Princess's solicitors, were harder than the public was permitted to see. Staff accounts later indicated that the Queen had pressed for Diana to keep a dignified status, and that several of the more punitive proposals on the palace side had been softened at her insistence. She had not wanted the mother of the future king diminished in public. A year later, on the 31st of August 1997, the call came from Paris in the early hours of the morning. The Queen was at Balmoral with William and Harry. Her decision to remain in Scotland for the boys' sake, rather than return immediately to London, became one of the most criticised judgments of her reign. The press accused her of coldness. The public, gathering in unprecedented numbers outside Buckingham Palace, accused her of distance. On the 5th of September, she returned to London, walked among the flowers, and spoke to the nation that evening in a broadcast carefully drafted to acknowledge what Diana had meant. Those who had known her longest understood that the days at Balmoral had not been indifference. They had been the protection of 2 boys from cameras in the only place she had ever found genuinely private. If this account has been useful, subscribing to the channel costs nothing, and there are more stories like this one queued. The bell notification means you will see them when they go up. In the years that followed, the staff who had been at Balmoral in September 1980 began slowly to speak. Stephen Barry's royal service had already appeared in 1983, before the worst of it, and read in retrospect like an early warning few had bothered to decode. Patrick Jeffson's Shadows of a Princess was published in 2000, careful, lawyerly, devastating in its restraint. Paul Burrell's A Royal Duty followed in 2003, more contested, more theatrical, but corroborated in its essentials by the other testimony. Tina Brown collected what remained in interviews and footnotes for the Diana Chronicles in 2007. Sally Bedell Smith assembled the official side for Elizabeth the Queen in 2012. Across all of these, a single picture emerges. The Queen had registered, before the engagement of the 24th of February 1981, that the match was unequal. Not unequal in rank, the Spencers were older nobility than the Windsors. Unequal in temperament, in timing, in the unfinished business with Camilla Parker Bowles that no one inside the household pretended did not exist. The warning, as the Footmen later called it, was not about Lady Diana Spencer. It was about Prince Charles. The Queen had seen that her son was being asked to marry one woman while still attached to another, and that a 19-year-old kindergarten assistant who had grown up on the Sandringham estate had no resources, no experience, and no warning of her own with which to absorb that fact. This is the harder reading of the evidence, and it is the reading the staff testimony supports. Elizabeth II was not prescient in any mystical sense. She was an observer of unusual discipline, trained from earliest childhood to read rooms in which nothing was said directly. What she saw in the late summer of 1980 was not a girl unworthy of her son. It was a son not yet ready to release the woman he loved, being delivered a wife who would discover this slowly, painfully, and in public. Why she did not stop it is the question that hangs over every account. The answer is constitutional and familial in equal measure. The Prince of Wales at 31 had to marry. Lord Mountbatten's assassination in August 1979 had removed the one figure who could speak to Charles with paternal authority on the subject. The Queen Mother and Ruth, Lady Fermoy, had aligned the candidacy from the Clarence House side. The press had decided the story before the family had finished considering it. A 54-year-old monarch in 1980, however shrewd, did not override a 31-year-old heir's stated wish on the basis of an instinct she could not have articulated in any minute that would have survived. So she did what her training permitted. She watched. She asked small questions. She set down a teacup with particular care on the morning of the 24th of February, 1981. She arranged for Lady Susan Hussey to mentor the new princess. She wrote, when she finally wrote, decisively. What the household staff later called the warning was, in retrospect, the moment when the institution chose continuity over caution. The Queen had seen it. She had said small things. She had not been heard because she had not been willing to say large ones. The footman with the tray, the one from the corridor outside the private sitting room in the summer of 1980, was interviewed many years later. He was asked what he remembered most about that summer. He did not say it was the sentence the Queen had spoken about the Spencer girl. He said it was the pause before she said it. A silence, he called it, of a particular quality. The kind a person makes when they have already understood something and are deciding whether it is theirs to say aloud. The entire tragedy of the Wales marriage was contained, for those who knew how to listen, in that silence at Buckingham Palace one afternoon in 1980. And the Queen, for the remaining 70 years of her life, never spoke of it again.